In June 2018, a Dutch court did something it had never done before. It banned a motorcycle club. The entire organization was dissolved by court order, with immediate effect. It was not one of the most powerful motorcycle clubs in the world. It was a club founded by 9 friends in a small town south of Rotterdam, the Netherlands. A club younger than most of its rivals by decades. Its name was Satudarah, One Blood. But the real question is, how do 9 men with no criminal pedigree and no territory become the most dangerous motorcycle club in European history? It starts with a promise that was never kept. After World War II, thousands of Malucan soldiers who had served in the Dutch colonial army found themselves in an impossible position. Indonesia had declared independence. The Dutch East Indies no longer existed. The Malucan soldiers had fought alongside the Dutch. They had done what they were asked. And when it was over, the Dutch government told them they could not go home. The Maluku Islands had been absorbed into the new Indonesian state. The dream of a separate Malucan homeland was gone. The soldiers and their families were relocated to the Netherlands and placed in temporary housing camps scattered across the country. The camps were supposed to be temporary. They were not. By the early 1960s, the camps had become permanent. Children were born inside them. A second generation grew up in towns that had not invited them, in a country that had brought their families there out of political necessity and then had no plan for what came next. Unemployment was structural. Racism was ordinary. The Malucan community existed inside the Netherlands without being part of it. That exclusion built pressure over decades. In December 1975, a group of young Malucan men hijacked a train near Bailen and simultaneously seized the Indonesian consulate in Amsterdam. Their demand was simple: recognize the Republic of South Maluku. The train siege lasted 12 days. 2 passengers and 1 hijacker died. The Dutch government did not recognize the Republic of South Maluku. 2 years later, in May 1977, another group hijacked a train near Assen. At the same time, they seized a primary school in Bovensmil. 105 children, 5 teachers, held hostage by men who had grown up in camps their government had promised were temporary. The school siege lasted 4 days. The train siege lasted 20. On June 11, 1977, Dutch Marines stormed the train at dawn. Fighter jets flew low overhead to create noise and disorientation. In the first seconds of the assault, 6 hijackers were killed. 2 passengers died with them. The government called it a success. The Malucan community called it something else entirely. The men who would go on to found Satudarah in 1990 were teenagers when the Marines stormed that train. Some had family connections to the communities that produced the hijackers. All of them had grown up watching their parents and older brothers demand recognition and receive armored vehicles instead. They had watched the Dutch state make a calculation that speed and force were cheaper than promises kept. The hijackings did not create Satudarah, but they created the men who did. A small town in South Holland that nobody outside the Netherlands had ever heard of, and in 1990, nobody had any reason to. 9 friends gathered there, most of Malucan descent, children and grandchildren of the men who had fought for the Dutch, been promised a homeland, and ended up in camps instead. They had grown up carrying that inheritance without anywhere to put it, so they built something of their own. They called themselves the heirs of the Malucan warriors. Their logo depicted an Alfour warrior, a symbol pulled directly from the island culture their grandparents had left behind. And their name came from 2 words in Indonesian and Malay: Satudarah, One Blood. What made them different from every other outlaw motorcycle club operating in Europe at that time was a single decision. While the Hells Angels, the Bandidos, and the Outlaws had all built their identities around whiteness, enforcing it through informal rules and sometimes explicit restrictions, Satudarah opened the door to everyone: Dutch, Malucan, Surinamese, Moroccan, Turkish, and Chilean. If you were loyal and you could handle what membership demanded, The patch was yours regardless of where you came from. That decision looked unremarkable in 1990. It would not look unremarkable for long. For the first decade, they remained exactly what they appeared to be. Local, small, a tight circle of men with motorcycles and a shared identity, built on displacement and brotherhood, known only to the communities around them and completely invisible to the wider world. They were not feared. They were not watched. They were not on anyone's radar. If they had stayed that way, this would not be a story worth telling. But the thing about One Blood is that blood does not stay contained. By 2011, that tight circle of 9 friends had become 9 chapters spread across the Netherlands, making Satudarah the second largest outlaw motorcycle club in the country. Only the Hells Angels had more. And for a club that had started in a town nobody had heard of, that was not a small thing. For years, a body called the Council of 8 had kept the peace between the major Dutch clubs. The Rad van Acht brought together the 8 largest outlaw motorcycle organizations in the Netherlands to mediate disputes and prevent the kind of open warfare that had made the Scandinavian biker wars international news in the 1990s. Satudarah had been admitted to the council in 1996, 6 years after founding, and for 15 years they operated within that structure, growing quietly, recruiting steadily, expanding their chapter network without drawing the kind of attention that invites consequences. Then, in early 2011, they were expelled. The specific reasons were never made public, which in itself told a story. What was public was the effect. Dutch police began reporting increased tensions almost immediately. Motorcycle events across the Netherlands were cancelled that summer out of fear they would become battlegrounds between Satudarah and the Hells Angels. Both clubs publicly denied any conflict was coming. The cancellations happened anyway. The council itself dissolved in 2013, partly as a consequence of the tensions the expulsion had created. What had been a managed ecosystem became an open competition with no referee and no rules. And rather than pull back, rather than reduce their profile and wait for the pressure to ease, Satudarah did the opposite. They looked at the open field in front of them and decided to run. Starting in 2011, Satudarah began moving beyond the Netherlands with a speed and method that no European outlaw motorcycle club had attempted before. The model was simple. Find existing local clubs in new countries, absorb them, convert them into Satudarah chapters, and move on to the next territory. What made it work where it would have failed for almost any other club was the one decision made in Moordrecht in 1990, the open door. There were Malucan diaspora communities in Belgium, Germany, and Scandinavia with direct cultural ties to the founding membership. But beyond those communities, there were entire populations across Europe that the Hells Angels and Bandidos had never been able to reach because their identity was built on exclusion. Irish traveler communities in Ireland, Turkish diaspora populations in Germany and Belgium, immigrant neighborhoods in France that had spent decades on the margins of European society. For all of them, Satudarah offered something that no other major outlaw club could. A patch that did not require you to be white to wear it. By 2012, they had chapters in Belgium and Germany. By 2013, Denmark and Norway. Sweden shortly after, then France, Spain, Switzerland, then Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Brazil, South Africa, Canada. By the middle of the decade, more than 70 chapters across more than 20 countries. Most outlaw motorcycle clubs spend decades building that kind of international presence. Satudarah built it in less than 5 years. Not everyone welcomed them. In Belgium, opening the Antwerp chapter in 2012 under the name Satudarah Belgium District 9 was not expansion into neutral territory. Belgium had been Hells Angels' ground for years. Moving into Antwerp was a direct provocation, and both sides knew it. The two clubs were now competing in the same cities, over the same criminal markets, in the same neighborhoods. Confrontations followed. Law enforcement in both countries began monitoring the friction from the moment the Antwerp chapter opened its doors, because they had seen what happened when two clubs of this size decided the same territory belonged to them. And as the chapters multiplied, the violence multiplied with them. Dutch prosecutors documented a pattern of armed assaults, drug trafficking, extortion, and weapons charges across multiple chapters. What they described was not a club with some criminal members. They described a club with a structural culture of violence, enforced from the top down, connected directly to the hierarchy. Members who stepped out of line faced internal consequences. Rivals who pushed back faced something worse. The club did not exist, despite that pressure. It was built around it, and it fed on it, and it grew. Germany was where the international expansion first ran into a wall. In early 2012, a Moroccan-born man named Ali Osman, who led a club called Brotherhood Clowntown, founded Satudarah's first German chapter. Around the same time, Dutch documentary filmmakers Joost van der Valk and Mags Gavin were being given 2 years of unprecedented access to the club's internal world. What Satudarah wanted to show was their brotherhood, their Malucan roots, their warrior heritage. The filmmakers found all of that. But following 4 of the club's rising leaders, Angelo, Ola, Mima, and Bota, they also captured something the club never intended to put on a film: the organizational strain of growing faster than trust could keep up with, the internal arguments about pace and control, the tension between what the club was founded to be and what it was rapidly becoming. The documentary aired on Dutch national television on June 22, 2015, watched by over 1 million people. By that point, the German chapter Ali Osman had built was already under intensive law enforcement surveillance. What investigators found was a chapter that had imported the club's criminal infrastructure and its internal enforcement methods directly into German territory. On February 24, 2015, German Interior Minister Thomas de Maizière announced a nationwide ban. Federal police simultaneously raided approximately 20 premises across 5 German states, seizing motorcycles, weapons, and cash. The ban was upheld in court. Then Ali Osman made a decision. He was facing up to 20 years. He entered a plea agreement with German prosecutors and cooperated fully, informing on members of the German chapter and on leadership in the Netherlands. Dutch Satudarah leaders went to prison partly on his testimony. Among them, Ola, one of the 4 men who had just been filmed as the future of the club, now sitting in court because of someone he had let in without truly knowing. When the cooperation became public, Ola was asked about it. His response was precise in its anger. Osman had said whatever he could to get a reduced sentence. In Germany, you cooperate, and your sentence drops. Osman would have faced 20 years and instead received 6.5. But then he said something that cut deeper than the anger. He said the problem abroad was that you did not know people. That in the Netherlands, if you did not know someone, you asked a neighbor or a friend. That if you wanted to join, someone had to vouch for you. But not in Germany. That single statement was the most honest diagnosis of what had gone wrong. The club's original membership model had been built on the tight-knit Malucan diaspora network of Moordrecht, where community ties served as a vetting system that no formal process could replicate. The faster they grew, the less they knew who they were letting in. And the less they knew, the more vulnerable they became. Ali Osman was Moroccan, not Malucan. He had not grown up in the diaspora community that built the one blood ethos from colonial displacement and generational rage. He had a club, he wanted a bigger patch, and he became the first German chapter president. When the pressure came, he made the rational calculation available to him. He talked, and Osman was not even the full extent of the problem. A leading Satudarah member in Germany named Christian John turned out to be an undercover police officer embedded inside the club's structure and gathering intelligence for an extended period before his identity became known. 2 informants and 1 undercover officer inside a single chapter. This was what expansion without vetting produced. This was what one blood looked like when the blood was no longer something anyone had checked. In 2014, A single coordinated police operation swept through the Swedish chapter and arrested every member on weapons and drug charges. The chapter had barely established itself before it was gone. It looked like a warning. It turned out to be the opening move of something much larger. Germany followed in February 2015 with the nationwide ban and the raids that came with it. 5 states, 20 premises, one morning. Then Australia. The Sydney chapter was raided and shut down in November 2015. The president arrested alongside 3 senior members. Law enforcement declared the Australian operation finished. In 2017, the Sydney chapter reopened. That detail mattered more than any of the raids that preceded it. The capacity to absorb a ban, regroup, and reconstitute was not a flaw in the system. It was the system, and every government that had celebrated a successful operation against Satudarah was about to find that out. June 18, 2018. The court in The Hague delivered the ruling that opened this story. The Dutch justice system banned and dissolved Satudarah MC and 2 of its supporting organizations, effective immediately. The ruling cited violent crime, extortion, drug trafficking, and arms trafficking. But what the court emphasized was not the individual charges. It was the culture. The violence was not incidental. It was not the product of a few bad actors operating outside the club's knowledge. It was structural. It was how the organization functioned at every level. Satudarah appealed. The appeal court confirmed the ban in June 2019. They appealed again to the Supreme Court. On November 13, 2020, the Supreme Court confirmed the dissolution. After 30 years, from 9 men in Moordrecht to over 2,000 members across Europe, Satudarah was formally declared illegal in the country of its birth. Norway took longer and went differently. Satudarah challenged the Norwegian ban in court and initially won. A lower court ruled in their favor, which was itself an extraordinary outcome. A banned criminal organization successfully arguing in a democratic court that the ban was unjustified. The government appealed. On October 9, 2024, the Norwegian Supreme Court reversed the decision and upheld the ban. The court noted that members had repeatedly committed serious offenses against life, health, and freedom, and that their conduct was designed to generate fear in the general population. The court also noted something else. Despite presenting itself as a motorcycle club open to ethnic minorities, membership in Satudarah did not require owning a motorcycle. It did not even require holding a license. They were not, the Norwegian Supreme Court concluded, a motorcycle club. They never really had been. In May 2023, the Danish chapter of Satudarah did something no court had forced them to do. They dissolved themselves, formally, officially. The chapter ceased to exist under that name. And then, almost immediately, the same men reappeared under a new one. Comanches MC. Same leadership, same hierarchy, same relationships, same criminal networks according to Danish law enforcement. Different patch. This was not a defeat. It was not even close to a defeat. It was a demonstration of the single most fundamental limitation of every ban that had come before it. Governments had spent a decade building legal frameworks sophisticated enough to dissolve an entire international organization by court order. And the Danish chapter had just walked around all of it in a single afternoon. The Dutch courts had already seen a version of this coming. After the 2018 ban in the Netherlands, former members began operating under a new name, Singa 19, using similar colors and running out of former Satudarah clubhouses. Dutch prosecutors argued it was continuation of the banned organization and should be treated as such. Dutch courts disagreed. Under Article 140 of the Dutch Criminal Code, wearing Singa 19 colors or using former Satudarah facilities was not prosecutable as continuation of Satudarah, even when the men inside were the same men who had worn the old patch the week before. The law had banned the name. The law had banned the patch. The law had banned the legal entity that existed on paper. But the law could not ban the relationships. It could not ban the loyalties, the trust networks, the criminal infrastructure, or the sense of brotherhood that had been built over 3 decades. Those things did not need a court order to keep existing. They just needed new patches and a different name on the door. What the Danish chapter did was more brazen than Singa 19 because they did not wait to be banned. They watched what happened in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Norway. And they made a calculation. They dissolved before any government could dissolve them, on their own terms and their own timeline, and they kept operating without missing a step. Governments had spent a decade learning how to ban Satudarah. Satudarah had spent that same decade learning that a name and a patch were not the same thing as an organization. And by 2023, it was clear which lesson had been more useful. In 2014, before the Dutch ban, there were approximately 1,000 outlaw motorcycle club members in the Netherlands. By 2020, 2 years after the ban that was supposed to eliminate Satudarah from Dutch territory entirely, that number had climbed to 2,500. The ban had not reduced the outlaw motorcycle ecosystem. It had more than doubled it. New clubs filled the space almost immediately. Supremos MC, King Syndicate MC. Former Satudarah members moved into them, bringing everything with them: their networks, their criminal contacts, their operational knowledge, their relationships with drug markets that had no reason to stop functioning because a court in The Hague had issued a ruling. Researchers studying the post-ban period found something that no government press release ever mentioned. Co-offending between former Satudarah members and non-members in drug-related activity actually increased after the ban. The organizational structure had been disrupted. The criminal activity had not. If anything, it had spread wider. Criminologists called it the waterbed effect. Press down hard enough in one place and the pressure does not disappear. It surfaces somewhere else. Dutch law enforcement had pushed hard through the late 2000s, and the pressure surfaced in Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway. When Germany closed, the pressure moved to countries that had not yet acted. When enough of Europe closed, the pressure surfaced in Australia, South Africa, and Southeast Asia. By the time the major European bans had all been issued, 60% of Satudarah's active chapters were operating outside Europe entirely, and those chapters were not remnants. They were not the dying embers of a defeated organization waiting to burn out quietly. The Canberra chapter president was arrested for drug trafficking while already inside prison, dealing from his cell while serving a sentence for a separate offense. The Sydney chapter that law enforcement declared finished in 2015 was operational again by 2017. Chapters across Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore continued without meaningful interruption throughout the entire period that European governments were celebrating their bans as victories. The researchers who studied this most closely chose their words carefully. Bans raise operational costs. They disrupt coordination. They enable asset seizures, and they weaken group cohesion over time. All of that is true, but none of it eliminates the conditions that produced the organization in the first place. And as long as those conditions exist, the waterbed keeps pushing back. The Malucan diaspora community that founded Satudarah in 1990 had grown up in a country that brought their families there, and then looked away. Their grandparents had been promised a homeland and given a camp. Their parents had grown up inside those camps and been told the situation was temporary. They had hijacked trains and seized schools and watched Marines storm the carriages at dawn. And after all of that, they were still there, still in the Netherlands, still outside the mainstream of a country that claimed them as residents but had never fully claimed them as belonging. If that structural reality had changed alongside the court rulings, the story might have ended differently. But it did not. The neighborhoods remained the same. The unemployment figures remained the same. The feeling of being permanently on the outside of a country that brought your family there and then forgot about them remained exactly the same in 2018 as it had been in 1990. 9 men in Moordrecht had built a club around that feeling. They built an empire on it. But the empire they built funded itself through drug markets, extortion and violence that preyed on the very communities the club had claimed to represent. The one-blood brotherhood that began as resistance to exclusion became its own form of exclusion, enforced not by race, but by fear. And in the end, the difference between the two was smaller than anyone who wore the patch would have admitted. Governments banned the name, courts dissolved the legal entity, police raided the clubhouses and seized the assets and held the press conferences. And in Denmark, the same men put on new patches and kept riding. If the conditions that built Satudarah had been addressed, the bans might have meant something permanent. But they were not addressed. The marginalization remained. The exclusion remained. The communities that Europe had left behind remained exactly where Europe had left them. One blood did not disappear. It just stopped answering to that name. Satudarah was founded on a wound that never healed, and it died the same way. The courts banned the name, the raids took the clubhouses, and the patches changed. But the conditions that built it in the first place never did. But what happens when the most feared motorcycle club on the planet stops pretending to follow rules entirely, and the men running it make governments across an entire continent wish they had never heard the name? Click the next video to see how that unfolded.